Hello and welcome to PS On Air, where Project Syndicate's writers come face to face with the newspapers that publish them. I'm Christopher Granville, a contributor to Project Syndicate myself, and my guest today is Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Among other things, I'll be discussing with Jeffrey his new book, Building the New American Economy, with the active assistance of Katharina Slodzyck, the London correspondent of Handelsbalatt, and Carlos de Vega, the deputy editor of País. So, Jeffrey Sachs, thank you very much for joining us. I've had an excellent pastime this week reading advance copies of the book. Great. Congratulations. I'm right up to date. Mention of President Trump in your preface. And then, even from a glance at the table of contents, readers can see that you are covering a great variety of elements for sustainable growth and development in the United States. So the question always with reform programs, going right back to developing world, emerging markets, is always sequencing, priorities, a tired debate. But if a genie could come out of a lamp and offer you a chance to make 3 wishes, what would be those top things which would make all the difference, which, if implemented, would facilitate the rest of the agenda?
If it's a really great genie, I would start with President Bernie Sanders, because
who's written a preface to your
Of course, Senator Sanders wrote the foreword, but it was meant to be President Bernie Sanders, because we really need a progressive turn in American politics. At least for the moment, we have perhaps exactly the opposite with Trump. So all of this is quite difficult politically. I guess the second point I would make is that for once I would like Washington to think. And that means that I'm not a fan at all of this first 100 days business. I'm not a fan at all, and was not with Obama, of his immediate stimulus of almost $1 trillion. I don't think our politicians think. And the issues we face are complicated. They're not simple. And we haven't had a tradition of thinking. We've had a tradition of acting and reacting for a long time. And I suppose the third thing I would recommend is make some goals, not immediate, not I'm going to do this tomorrow, but in the book and in the world with the Sustainable Development Goals, these are goals for the year 2030. Now, all of the countries of the UN, including the United States, adopted them, but I'm sure that our current U.S. government never heard of them. And I would really like the U.S. government, our Congress, to realize that we're signed up to sustainable development. It's a concept hardly known in the United States in the high politics, though students know it. Yep. And I would like them to understand that we need some big goals to change the direction of American society.
If memory serves me right, there are 17 of those goals.
There are.
The last one of which is working together on the previous 16, if I recall. So of those 16, if I can press you, I don't insist on 3, but
sure.
In terms of urgency, where would you place the emphasis?
It depends where you are and who you are in the world. If you're the United States, we don't have the problem of extreme poverty. Yep. We have other problems. We're a major contributor to human-made climate change, SDG 13. Our infrastructure hasn't really been rebuilt for 50 years. This is an area where Donald Trump has talked about doing something. That's SDG 9. So I would say the priorities for the U.S. maybe would be SDGs 9, 10, and 13. 9 and 13, infrastructure and energy, and SDG 10 is more fair, less inequality, because we became an incredibly unequal society.
So it's the distributional and then the environmental.
Exactly.
And also the infrastructure, which is linked to the environment as well.
That's it.
Okay, so that needs a lot of public action. In your book, Jeff, you're very open about the need for bigger government. And in your, I think, first chapter, you show a ranking, which you've done, of OECD countries, how they stack up in terms of performance under the UN Sustainable Development. And the top countries are mainly Scandinavian, if I recall correctly, which whose governments spend a large share of GDP. But there are other countries where governments also spend a lot of GDP, which are well down the list. For example, France.
Yeah.
So there would appear to be a difference between big government that's effective and big or bigger government, which is less effective.
Yeah.
Now, how would you explain that? Because diagnosing that correctly is surely an important part if you're applying that principle to the United States or anywhere else.
I think the most successful countries in the world, indeed, in a lot of things, prosperity, sustainable development, decency, low corruption, are the Scandinavian countries. So we all should take the moment and try to understand what makes Denmark, Norway, Sweden tick. How does it work? There's a kind of seriousness of governance there. They're very lucky, and their governments are out to solve problems. There is a high degree of social capital. The level of trust is quite high. They collect taxes, and they use the taxes, I think, very effectively to ensure access to quality health care, child care, education, and so forth. So a lot of good lessons.
A lot of things to emulate.
You take a country like France. I think it's a pretty wonderful country, by the way, but you take a country like France, which isn't doing it quite as well, and there are a few specific things I would say in my own diagnosis. They tax and spend a lot, but a huge amount of it is their pension system, which is incredibly generous and too generous in a way, but the politics has not been able to crack that because that's such a powerful lobby.
If I can just take you back to that concept of trust. You mentioned trust as a very important part of the Scandinavian success story. And I'd just like to put that in the context of redistribution, basically higher taxation, which is a very important theme in your book. I mean, doesn't this go way beyond standard politics, changing this tax law, that tax law? It's about civic values. There's a lot of ethical agenda here, which goes way beyond political cycles, it seems to me. Would that be fair? And then we can perhaps put that in the present political context.
It's completely fair, and that's the second word of smart, fair, and sustainable, which is the subtitle of the book. This is a society in which everybody should do all right. And by the way, nobody, they think, should do so super spectacularly that they're abusing the social order. So when a Scandinavian CEO takes a pension or severance pay of an American style of tens of millions of dollars in severance, there's opprobrium. Who do you think you are to get that kind of pay? And some of the business people I know, or a couple that have been involved in that, quote, scandal, say, but that's how it's done in America. They say, yeah, but we're not America. In our country, we want more equality as a positive idea. There's another sense, of course, which is that everybody pays taxes and everybody gets benefits. And the idea that in America, I don't want to pay tax for that guy. Yeah. I don't want to pay tax. They're completely different. And so the fact of our diversity and low level of trust, and we have an idea in America, which I think is a horrible idea, that there are the doers and the moochers, the people taking. And if you're taking from the system, you're cheating it somehow. And this is a horrible idea because it means we don't really have a trusting society. We can't have basic social decency.
There is something also that was very interesting for me in the book about the future of jobs. How are going to be jobs in the future? Technology is advancing. The unemployment rate in the U.S. is very low, but at the same time we have a lot of poor workers, like it happens here in Europe, in Spain. So when we think about how it's going to be the job in the future, what is going to be like this? I mean, are we going to work less but get less income also? The quality of life is going to change because there is not enough money for everybody. How do you envision it?
I think the basic idea is that a lot of the technological marvel that we have right now, the worldwide information revolution, robotics, artificial intelligence, all those cool things, self-driving vehicles, they make it possible to do things better, cooler, safer, lots of opportunity. But and the shorthand for an economist would say they make a bigger pie, the economic pie. But the pie is really cut in a different way also by these same technologies. You don't need the low-skill work as much. The demand for labor goes down. Wages go down. Jobs aren't available because you don't even need a barista because the machines are automatic. They take your iris scan. They take your automatic online payment. They give you your usual coffee. And a lot of service sector jobs, which were the jobs that were created, probably those will quickly go away. So what does one make of that weird combination of better things to do, but this shift of income distribution? Well, there you can then imagine the dystopia society in which the robots do all the work, a few people basically own them, and everybody else suffers. And we've got enough sci-fi, science fiction, to tell us that that's one course that's possible. But the other idea is that with all this wonderful technology, we're able to live better, have more leisure time, but there must be some fair sharing of this bigger pie. And so taxation comes back into the story. And you don't let all the wealth go to a few people. You make sure that it's widely spread and that we're able to share the benefits.
Well, the roadmap you are sort of describing for solving the big challenges of the US, it does sound sensible, but it could be a little bit too radical for Republicans having the majority in Congress and for Trump. So if you were honest, how high are the chances for implementation of this policy?
Right now, very small, but over a reasonable number of years, much higher than it looks. Bernie Sanders could be president right now. You know, he lost to Hillary by a pretty narrow margin. And if things had gone, you know, a little bit differently, maybe if the system wasn't so biased against his kind of challenge, he would have won, and I think he would have defeated Trump in the general election because they were both insurgents, and Bernie is the real thing. So we're not so far from it in American politics, and things that...
So what needs to happen?
Well, better election results, for one thing, more mobilized young people, because
But you don't see a chance in the current government for somebody to be open for this idea of redistribution?
For most of this, I don't think the Republican Party is about to jump at this, but I do see this book as helping people to understand what the real issues are in the U.S. And one of my, I'll call it naive in quotation marks, ideas is that politics ought to be about ideas again. I think the whole world would root for that we get back to a politics of ideas. Now, if you look at the kinds of ideas that I'm propounding, the millennial generation, roughly 20 to 35-year-olds, this is already a majority view. There's nothing in what I'm saying that is outlandish.
So they're in favor of increasing taxes and
they're in favor of larger government. They're in favor of government responsibility. The word social, which was a nightmare for Fox TV viewers and a lot of older Americans, doesn't faze them at all. Young people, that term 30 years ago would have been, you're a commie, get out of here. But now young people are saying, yeah, we need something different.
I would like to follow something that you said in this program. We need politicians who think long-term, planning. It's an idea that is repeated several times in the book. But, okay, at the same time, politicians want results. Many voters want results immediately. We have this culture of fast TV cycle news. So what is the roadmap to change that? How can we go to a society more quiet, more thinking more? I mean,
there's in psychology the famous Marshmallow Test, where you put a 4-year-old in a room with a marshmallow or a piece of chocolate, and the psychologist tells the child, you could eat that now, or I'm going to go out of the room for a couple of minutes, but if you wait till I come back for a few minutes, you can have 2. And so it's a test of delayed gratification. And what psychologists discovered is that 4-year-olds that are able to delay their gratification have a life course by high school and so forth that is much more successful. So you learn something about a 4-year-old, you can predict something way down the road. So I've been saying for a long time that America fails the Marshmallow Test because we can't delay gratification. Every politician comes in, we're going to cut your taxes, we're going to cut your taxes. Or Obama, who I liked and supported, but then was very disappointed with, when it came to infrastructure, he said we need shovel-ready infrastructure, which in the American jargon means the project already has to be ready. We have to be able to implement it. Why? Take a moment. Think. Plan. You know, you can't shovel-ready a faster rail, intercity rail. You have to take time to think.
After the first weeks in office of Trump, would you like to change something to the book? Maybe add something more basic to it? Explain what it means to be the president of the U.S.? And
well, I should have written it only with 140 characters. You know, the mistake was to write a whole book, even though it's a short one. Apparently this guy doesn't read, but maybe some of his advisors will read, and I'm thinking, and I've heard some nice things back from Capitol Hill, and I've talked to the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the U.S. Congress, which is about 80 of the more left of center politicians, and I'm suggesting some very practical things that I think they can do.
The straight question is if you feel that the Trump presidency is going to complete the 4 years, or if it's really a matter of months or years, or something could happen. And in that case, I'm wondering if the U.S. institutions are strong enough now to resist or to fight against something like this. I'm thinking about 30, 40 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court was strong. The Congress had really big figures in politics. Press was prestigious, and now the press is... So is really a balance of power strong enough if there is the point that they have to fight, or they have to oppose, or they have to impeach a presidency like the Trump's?
The U.S. isn't wrecked. The U.S. has very strong institutions in many areas. If they were tasked with helping to solve some of these problems, which is what a wise politician would do, he would say to the National Academy of Sciences, we have an infrastructure challenge. What would be a good way forward? And the National Academy of Engineers would have some of the world's best engineers to give ideas about that. Our politicians don't do that. They don't even remember to do that anymore because they're all taking money and trying to run for office, and that's the whole game is money and ads and power, not solving problems.
And campaign finance, you mentioned also.
Especially the campaign financing is relentless. What's wrong with the American system? I think there's some things that are close to the surface that are obvious, and the worst is the money in politics. It's pervasive. We have one of the most corrupt politics of any place in the world that I know. It's probably true that most of the money isn't going into the pockets of the politicians themselves, though some is. I think there is a deeper problem, which is a really tricky problem, which is that America prides itself on its stability of a constitution which was adopted in 1789. We've had one constitution for more than 2 centuries. It's pretty impressive. But if I were to evaluate the quality of the Constitution now, I think we've learned enough to know that there are some very deep flaws in it.
A bit out of date.
To my mind, the biggest flaws, I would not have a president at all. I would have a president that's ceremonial, maybe even king or queen, but I would instead have a parliamentary system. We'd be much less likely to have a Trump that way because the president wouldn't be this powerful figure that can run wars and start wars by themselves, and I regard that as a huge flaw of the American system. And the system is really, at this point, not designed for long-term planning and thinking.
So
right
we're
now.
running a bit out of time. Katharina, I give you one more chance. What would you like to finish with?
Well, maybe a little bit your approach to, well, maybe to certain countries and to economics. You came quite a long way, and I remember some books you wrote about high IT and how to help countries like this, and now you've wrote a book about the US. So would you consider the US underdeveloped country, because your focus has been on underdeveloped countries for so long? So
I said to myself, and I remember when I decided it back in the early 80s, the U.S. can take care of itself. I'm going to help poorer countries, developing countries, countries in crisis. And I said, I thought the marginal product of the work would be higher if I was helping countries that were struggling with poverty or disease or other issues. But then I came to feel, my God, are we off track? It's not the problem of managing poverty as much as the problem of managing affluence, in the sense that the United States has everything it needs, but cannot manage decency right now, taking care of people that need help, thinking about the long term, stopping the greed for long enough to say we're going to handle the environmental crises. So I came back to writing and thinking about the U.S. already several years ago with a book called The Price of Civilization, because I came to feel the U.S. is in its own crisis. And it is a real crisis. Now it's a crisis of the world, because the U.S. has enough weapons and enough might and enough power and enough centrality in the economic system that when things go wrong in the U.S., like the 2008 financial crash, God forbid with the current president, everybody pays a price on that. So we better actually take some time to fix the U.S. But I'm not trying to fix it to make it more wealthy, blah, 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 because that's not the point. It's to be
managing affluence,
smart, fair, and sustainable, which is really the point.
Well, thanks, I think we'll have to end it there. Those are the catchwords of the book, and a very good note to end on. You mentioned the economist's concept of marginal products, and the return on time and effort matters, is very large in the United States context, matters for the whole world as well. I think we've had a very good marginal product from this discussion. We've got through a lot of ground. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Katharina and Carlos, for your questions, and all of you for joining us on PS On Air. Thanks very much.